I remember the room going quiet, not the polite kind, the heavy kind where everyone suddenly feels exposed. It was just a second, but in that second, my life split into before and after. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I did not even look angry. I just stood there holding my hand out while a powerful man decided I was invisible. And that simple choice he made started everything. My name is Claire Mason, at least that is the name. People know me by now. Back then, I was just another woman in a tailored jacket, walking into a building that smelled like power and cold confidence. The glass tower reflected the morning sun, and for a moment I paused outside, checking my reflection, not because I doubted myself, but because I had learned that when you walk into rooms like this, people judge you before you speak. Your clothes, your posture, your calm. I had learned to control all of that. Years ago, I was not born into money, no family connections, no shortcuts. I built my company quietly while louder people took credit for things they barely understood. My work lived in the background, fixing problems no one wanted to admit existed. I was patient because patience keeps you alive in business, and that patience had brought me to this meeting, the one that would connect my company to something much bigger. Inside the lobby, people moved fast, avoiding eye contact like everyone was late for something important. I checked in, took the elevator, and watched the numbers rise. My heartbeat stayed steady because I had done my homework, every figure memorized, every risk mapped. I knew why I was there, and more importantly, I knew why he needed me. His name was Richard Hale, billionaire CEO, media favorite, the kind of man people described as visionary when they really meant ruthless. He was praised for confidence when it was really ego. People feared him because he never yelled, he dismissed, and dismissal cuts deeper than anger. He had a habit of deciding who mattered within seconds and treating everyone else like furniture. The boardroom was already half full when I arrived. Leather chairs, polished table screens, glowing softly with data investors, lawyers, advisors, all of them smiling in that careful way people do when power is nearby. One chair at the head of the table was empty, and everyone knew who owned it. The air felt tight, like the room itself was waiting. Then the door opened. Richard walked in without looking up, his phone still in his hand. Conversation stopped, chairs shifted. He finally looked up and his eyes landed on me, just long enough to measure me. Then they moved on like I had already failed some test. I never agreed to take introductions, began names, titles, polite nods. When it was my turn, I stood, stepped forward, smiled and held out my hand. It was a normal professional gesture, something so basic it should not have mattered. Richard looked at my hand, then at my face, then he turned away and sat down. No words, no reaction, just silence. I stood there for a moment, longer than comfort allowed. My hand still raised, the room felt heavy, someone cleared their throat. I lowered my hand and sat down slowly. Everyone saw it, no one said anything, and that was the moment the insult landed. Not loud, not dramatic, just complete erasure to anyone watching later. It might sound small, just a handshake, but in that room it meant you do not exist, you are not worth acknowledging. I felt it clearly, and as the meeting went on, he made sure I understood. He interrupted me, spoke over me, ignored my points, then repeated them later as his own people laughed politely. I stayed calm, not because I was weak, but because anger would have cost me what patience would earn by the end of the meeting. Richard got what he wanted, access, insight time. What he did not realize was what he had given me a reason. As we stood to leave, people shook hands when he reached me. He hesitated, then nodded. Still no handshake. I nodded back and smiled because in that moment I made a decision. I would not react. I would not confront. I would not complain. I would wait. I walked out of that building, calm, quiet, and focused. Richard believed the meeting had gone perfectly. He believed I was forgettable. What he did not know was that by refusing that one handshake, he had just opened a door, and once you are inside someone's world, you can see everything. And when you see everything, nothing is safe. Before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand something about me, something Richard never bothered to learn. I did not look powerful because I had learned that real power stays quiet. I did not announce my past because my past was never meant to impress anyone. It was meant to prepare me. I grew up watching doors close softly, not slam, just quietly shut in my face. I learned early that people underestimate women who listen more than they speak. Teachers, bosses, investors, even family. They assumed silence meant weakness. I let them believe that because while they talked, I observed patterns, habits, mistakes. I collected them the way others collect favors. My first company failed, not loudly, not in a dramatic way. It just faded. Clients left, bills piled up. And one morning I locked the office door for the last time. I remember sitting in my car, staring at my hands, wondering how something you build with everything you have can disappear so easily. That failure taught me something important. Never build anything that depends on other people's approval. The second time I built differently, smaller, quieter, smarter. I focused on systems, the things that keep companies alive, even when leadership makes bad decisions: compliance, data, security, financial flow, the boring things executives ignore until it is too late. My firm specialized in seeing cracks long before they became headlines, and that is why Richard Hale's team reached out to me. They did not come directly, of course, people like him never do. It was an assistant, then a consultant, then a lawyer, all circling, carefully asking questions without admitting why they needed answers. I saw the concern immediately: irregularities hidden under confidence patterns that suggested pressure behind the scenes. Richard's empire looked solid from the outside, but inside it was stretched thin. I agreed to the meeting because I wanted to see him for myself. I wanted to understand the man behind the image, and in that boardroom he showed me exactly who he was. Someone who believed power meant never having to acknowledge those he relied on, and that belief is dangerous. After the meeting, I went back to my office and closed the door. I replayed every moment, not emotionally, but strategically, every interruption, every dismissal, every detail. I asked myself one question: what does a man like Richard fear? And the answer came quietly: loss of control. People like him build their identity on dominance, the illusion that they are always ahead, always untouchable. They do not fear failure, they fear exposure. And I had just been invited closer than anyone realized. Over the next few weeks, I did exactly what he expected. Nothing. I stayed professional, responsive, quiet. My team began reviewing the materials his company had shared, and the deeper we went, the clearer it became. This was not just sloppy management. There were shortcuts, hidden risks, layers of decisions made to protect image over stability. Nothing illegal yet, but fragile, dangerously fragile. Richard began calling less. His interest faded. The insult had done its job in his mind. I was no longer important, and that was the opening I needed, because when powerful people stop watching you, they stop protecting themselves. I started mapping connections, suppliers, contracts, timelines, promises that depended on other promises. Everything was connected like a tower built from glass. It looked impressive, but one shift in pressure could cause everything to crack. I did not cause the cracks, I just learned where they already were at night. I would sit alone with my laptop reviewing files, listening to the hum of the city outside my window, and I felt something I had not felt during the meeting: clarity. This was not about revenge fueled by anger. It was about balance, about showing someone the consequences of believing others are disposable. I remembered his face when he looked past me, not angry, just bored. That memory kept me focused, not bitter focused, because bitterness makes mistakes, and I could not afford mistakes then. Something unexpected happened. Richard's team asked for more access, deeper access information. They would never offer someone they respected. They thought I was harmless, a background technician, someone grateful for the opportunity. I said yes, calmly while documenting everything, because documentation is truth. When narratives start shifting, I began to see how often his company leaned on quiet people like me, consultants, analysts, contractors, whose work held everything together while leadership took credit. The disrespect was systemic, and Richard was its symbol. Weeks passed, then months. The market shifted slightly, nothing dramatic, just enough to increase pressure. Investors started asking questions. Richard started making promises he could not keep internally. His team began cutting corners faster. The cracks widened, and I did nothing to stop it. I told myself this was not personal, and that was mostly true. But there was still that moment in the boardroom, that silent dismissal, and I knew that when everything finally came into the light, he would remember it. The call came late one evening, Richard himself on the line. His tone was different, careful, polite. He needed help urgently. Something was wrong. Numbers were not lining up and he wanted answers fast. I listened calmly, took notes, and said I would review everything. When the call ended, I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time since that meeting. Not because I was happy, but because the roles had shifted. He no longer looked down on me. He needed me, and he did not even realize how much that night I made a choice. I would not protect him. I would protect the truth. And sometimes the truth feels like revenge to people who have never been held accountable. What Richard did not know was that the very systems he ignored, the ones he let people like me manage quietly, were about to speak for themselves. And when they did, there would be no handshake, no nod, no dismissal that could save him. By the time I woke up the next morning, I already knew something was shifting. Not in the headlines, not in the market, just in the tone of the emails I opened, before I even finished my coffee. People were asking questions carefully at first. Then, with growing urgency, I had seen this pattern before, when confidence starts to leak out slowly like air from a sealed room. Richard's company had built its reputation on certainty. Every statement bold, every projection optimistic. Investors loved that kind of clarity. But clarity built on pressure does not last. And the pressure was rising quietly. I did not push it. I did not warn him either. I simply watched and recorded, because moments like this do not need force. They need patience. My team noticed it too. Analysts who had spent years looking at patterns began flagging inconsistencies, small delays, payments that arrived a day late, approvals that suddenly needed extra signatures. Nothing dramatic, but together they told a story of internal strain. Richard was making decisions faster than his structure could support, and speed without stability creates cracks. I remembered something my first mentor once told me: when people rush, it is because they are afraid of standing still. Richard could not stand still. His empire depended on constant movement, constant expansion, constant noise, and now that noise was starting to cover fear. Another call came, this time from his chief financial officer. Her voice was tight, controlled but tired. She asked for reassurance, wanted confirmation that everything was normal. I told her the truth carefully, that systems were under stress, that transparency would help. She thanked me and hung up without responding to the advice. I realized then that this was bigger than Richard. This was a culture built on dismissal, ignoring warnings until they became emergencies, and blaming quiet people when things went wrong. I had seen it destroy companies before, but never from this close. Days passed, then weeks, and the pressure continued to build. Investors requested additional reports. Media began asking about delays. Richard responded with confidence publicly, while scrambling privately. His team leaned on me, harder, sending files late at night, requesting rapid reviews, expecting solutions without wanting explanations. I provided exactly what they asked for, no more, no less. I fixed nothing quietly anymore, because fixing without acknowledgement only hides problems longer. Instead, I documented every weakness, every decision, every ignored recommendation. I was not creating the collapse. I was making sure no one could pretend they did not see it. One evening, I found myself back in the memory of that boardroom. His refusal to meet my hand, the way he had decided in seconds that I was insignificant. That memory no longer hurt. It clarified something important. He had never believed consequences applied to him, and that belief is fragile. The turning point came during a routine audit. Something small, a discrepancy buried deep in vendor contracts. Nothing illegal, just misleading. But misleading at scale becomes explosive. The numbers tied back to executive decisions. Richard's signature appeared more than once, approving risks without safeguards. I flagged it internally, calmly, professionally. The response was silence, then a rushed call telling me to stand down, that it would be handled. That was the moment I stopped being a consultant and became a witness. I secured everything: emails, files, call records, timestamps, because when stories change, evidence stays honest. I slept very little that week. Not from stress, but from focus, because this was the narrow bridge where everything could tip. Then Richard called again, his voice sharper, this time less polite. He wanted reassurance, control, answers. I gave him none of those. I gave him facts. He did not like facts because facts do not bend to authority. The next morning, the first article appeared, cautious, neutral, but asking the right questions. Investors noticed, phones started ringing, meetings were cancelled, then rescheduled, then cancelled again. The building that once felt untouchable now felt exposed. I stood in my office watching the city lights flicker on and off, thinking about how quickly power shifts when attention turns. And I knew this was only the beginning. What Richard still did not understand was that this was not a crisis I created. It was a mirror he had avoided, and once you see yourself clearly, there is no going back. By the fourth week, everything felt heavier: the air, the silence between phone calls, the way people chose their words carefully. Richard's company was no longer moving forward. It was reacting, and reaction is always slower than preparation. I could hear it in every conversation. The confidence was thinning inside my office. Nothing had changed: the same desk, the same quiet hum of servers, the same routines I kept deliberately because chaos outside makes discipline inside more important than ever. My team worked calmly, methodically, while other departments across the city scrambled. The media attention grew, not loud yet, but persistent reporters asking questions that executives hate because they are simple and direct. When did you know what changed? Why now? Richard answered with smiles and practiced lines, but I could hear the tension even through recorded clips. He was no longer leading the story, he was chasing it. Then came the internal emails labeled urgent, marked confidential, filled with requests for reassurance and language to soften disclosures. They wanted to shape the narrative before the facts became public, and that was when I knew they were already too late. Narratives collapse when they are built on denial. I attended another meeting. This one virtual. Richard's face appeared on the screen, composed but strained. His eyes moved, constantly scanning reactions, searching for control when he spoke. His voice was firm but clipped. He thanked everyone for their hard work and reminded us of loyalty. The word loyalty hung in the air, heavy and misplaced. When it was my turn to speak, I stayed factual. I outlined risks, timelines, consequences. I did not soften anything. I did not dramatize either. Facts do enough damage on their own. The silence after I finished was longer than comfortable. Richard broke it with a laugh, forced quick. He said, "We appreciate your perspective, Claire. We will take it under advisement." The same phrase people use when they plan to ignore you again. But this time something was different. People were watching him, not me. They were listening more carefully, because fear shifts attention upward and sideways, never downward anymore. After the call, I received a message from someone inside his legal team, a short note asking if we could talk privately. I agreed. We met that evening in a quiet restaurant far from offices and cameras. She looked exhausted and spoke quickly. She said the pressure was intense. Decisions were being rushed, protections bypassed, and she was worried about liability. I listened and said very little, because when people are afraid, they reveal more than they intend. I did not promise anything. I did not threaten. I simply told her to document everything. She nodded like someone who already knew. That advice was late, but necessary. Over the next days, more people reached out quietly. Analysts, managers, assistants, people who had watched warnings ignored for years. They were not looking for revenge. They were looking for safety. And I realized something important. The collapse of Richard's control was not caused by one insult. It was caused by a culture that taught everyone to stay silent. I did not expose him publicly. I did not leak information. I did not need to. The truth was already moving forward on its own. All I had to do was stop shielding it. Investors began pulling back cautiously at first. Then decisively, meetings ended without decisions. Funding paused, expansion plans froze. Richard's empire was still standing, but its foundation was cracking, visibly. One night Richard called again, this time late. His voice was low, controlled, but edged with frustration. He asked why I was not helping more, why I was not finding solutions the way I used to. I told him the truth. Solutions require respect, transparency, and time, none of which had been present from the beginning. He was silent. Then he said, "You're overreacting, Claire. People like you always do." That sentence settled between us, like dust. People like you, meaning quiet people, meaning women, meaning those he believed existed to serve without being seen. I ended the call politely and sat in the dark for a long time. Not angry, not shaken, just clear, because that sentence confirmed everything I needed to know. The next morning, regulators announced a review. Not dramatic, just procedural, but markets react to words like review. The stock dipped, then dipped again, and panic began to spread inside. Richard's company emails turned frantic, blame shifted, downward meetings turned hostile. I stayed out of it publicly. I focused on accuracy, on preserving records, on protecting my team, because storms pass, but evidence remains. I thought about that first meeting. The handshake, the dismissal, the assumption that I was small and replaceable, and I realized the irony. Richard had believed power meant never needing others, and now he was surrounded by people afraid to stand near him as pressure mounted. He tried to control the narrative more aggressively, threatening legal action, demanding loyalty speeches, replacing accountability with force, and force only accelerates collapse. By the end of that week, his board called an emergency session behind closed doors. No cameras, no statements, just fear and calculation. I did not attend that meeting, but I felt its impact immediately. Contracts paused, payments delayed, decisions reversed. The machine was grinding against itself at night. I walked home. Instead of taking a car, the city felt different, quieter, like it was holding its breath. I realized this was no longer about revenge. It was about consequence. Richard had built a world where respect was optional and silence was expected. Now that world was answering him. By the time the board meeting ended, the shockwaves were already moving outward. I could feel it in the sudden quiet of my inbox, the pause between messages, the kind of silence that means decisions are being made without you. And that silence told me something important. Richard was no longer in control of the room. People assume power disappears loudly, but most of the time it fades in private conversations and closed doors. It fades when confidence turns into caution and loyalty turns into distance. I watched it happen from the outside calmly, because once power starts leaking, it never stops on its own. That week, my name appeared more often in emails, but not from Richard, not anymore. His messages stopped entirely. Instead, they came from lawyers, board members, compliance officers, people asking careful questions framed as requests but heavy with fear. They wanted clarity, they wanted timelines, they wanted reassurance that the ground beneath them was not already giving way. I answered every question honestly and completely, because honesty is disarming when people expect manipulation. I did not exaggerate, I did not soften. I simply explained what the systems showed, what the risks were, and what could no longer be undone inside. Richard's company tension turned inward. Departments blamed each other. Meetings ended in frustration. Executives who once spoke in bold visions now spoke in fragments. Every sentence weighed, every word guarded. The culture of dismissal had finally turned on itself. I heard from a former assistant who had worked directly under Richard. She told me how he paced his office, how his temper flared, how he demanded updates every hour. She said he could not understand why things were slipping when he was still giving orders the way he always had. That was the core of it. He believed authority was enough. He believed speaking made things true. He never learned the difference between command and trust. One afternoon, I was asked to attend another virtual meeting, this time with the board. Present, Richard sat at the center of the screen, his posture rigid, his face tight. He opened with confidence, but it sounded rehearsed, like a speech repeated too many times. When questions came, they did not come gently. They were direct: financial exposure, governance failures, ignored warnings. Richard deflected, blamed market conditions, blamed advisors, blamed timing. He did not take responsibility even once when it was my turn. I spoke slowly and clearly. I explained that these issues had been documented months earlier, that recommendations had been made and dismissed, that the risks were known long before the review was announced. The room went quiet. Richard looked at me the same way he had in that first meeting, measuring, dismissing, trying to shrink me with his eyes. But it did not work anymore because the room was no longer his. A board member asked why these recommendations were not acted on earlier. Richard hesitated just long enough for the truth to show through. He said we had other priorities. That answer sealed it. After the call ended, I received a message from one of the board members thanking me for my transparency and asking me to forward documentation. I already had it organized, ready and complete, because preparation always outpaces panic. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, not from relief, but from certainty. The path forward was no longer uncertain. The outcome was no longer mine to decide. It was unfolding exactly as systems do when pressure meets reality. Over the next days, the news escalated. Headlines grew sharper, questions grew louder, stock value dropped steadily, and internally leadership fractured. Richard's voice disappeared from public statements, replaced by careful, neutral language from spokespeople. Then came the announcement: an internal restructuring, temporary leadership changes pending review. The words were soft, but the meaning was clear. Richard had been sidelined. I did not celebrate. I did not feel triumph. What I felt was gravity, the kind that settles in when something irreversible has happened. I received one final message from Richard, late at night, short and clipped, asking if we could talk privately. I stared at it for a long time before responding. Yes, the call was different from every other one. His voice was quieter, no sharp edges, no confidence, just exhaustion. He asked why I had not warned him, why I had not pushed harder. I told him the truth. I had warned him many times. He simply never listened. He was silent. Then he said, "I never thought it would come from you." That sentence echoed the insult from the beginning. The assumption that I was harmless, that I would absorb disrespect quietly, that I would protect him without being acknowledged. I told him something I had never said aloud. Power does not come from being feared. It comes from being accountable, and when you treat people like they do not matter, eventually they stop holding things together for you. He did not argue. He did not apologize. The call ended without resolution, just silence when it was over. I sat alone thinking about how small moments shape large outcomes, how a single gesture can reveal a character, and how character always writes the ending. This was not revenge in the way people imagine. It was consequence moving at its own pace. And Richard was finally standing in the space he had created. After the call ended, I stayed seated for a long time, staring at the dark screen, my reflection faint and tired, staring back at me. It was strange how quiet everything felt when the noise finally stopped. For months, my days had been filled with urgency, questions, decisions. Now there was space, and space forces you to think. The next morning, the city woke up to another headline, not explosive, just final. The board had officially removed Richard from daily operations pending the outcome of the review. The language was neutral, but the meaning was sharp. He was out of the room he once ruled inside his company. Confusion spread. People whispered in hallways, scheduled meetings disappeared, calendars cleared. Assistants did not know who to answer to anymore. Leadership without direction creates fear, and fear reveals character. Some executives rushed to distance themselves, rewriting history, claiming concerns had always existed. Others went silent, hoping invisibility would protect them. I watched it all without commentary, because once truth is public, behavior becomes evidence. My role shifted quietly. I was no longer just a consultant. I was now a reference point. People checked facts against my documentation, timelines against my records. It was strange how quickly credibility grows when someone refuses to bend it. I received messages from people I'd never met thanking me for speaking clearly, for not covering things up, for not letting the pressure erase reality. I did not respond to most of them, not out of arrogance, but because this was never about recognition. It was about balance. Then came the backlash, because accountability always creates resistance. Articles appeared, questioning motives, anonymous sources suggesting personal grudges, implying emotion had driven decisions. I expected it. Narratives do not collapse without trying to rebuild themselves. One article suggested I had been resentful from the start, offended by a minor slight. I read it slowly, calmly, because it was half true and completely wrong. Yes, the insult mattered, but not because it hurt my pride. It mattered because it revealed how Richard treated people who held his structure together. Still, rumors spread, and for the first time my name was public, not just inside boardrooms but outside, on screens and headlines. Strangers formed opinions without knowing the full story, and I learned something new. Exposure is its own kind of pressure. Friends asked if I was okay. My team worried about backlash. I reassured them, because fear thrives on uncertainty, and I had none. The facts were solid, the documentation clear. No narrative could erase what had already been confirmed. Then something unexpected happened. Richard broke his silence. He released a statement, carefully worded, speaking about misunderstanding and market conditions and lessons learned. He did not mention me by name, but the implication was clear. Someone had failed him, not the other way around. That was when I decided to speak, not emotionally, not defensively. Just truthfully. I agreed to a single interview with conditions. No speculation, no personal attacks, just a factual account of events during the interview. I spoke slowly, deliberately. I described the warnings, the documentation, the decisions ignored. I did not mention the handshake. I did not mention the insult, because the story was bigger than that moment. When the interview aired, the response was immediate. Not outrage, not applause, but clarity. People recognized the pattern. They had seen it in other companies, other leaders, other industries. The narrative shifted again, this time toward accountability. Inside myself, something shifted too. The anger I never fully admitted drained away, replaced by something steadier: acceptance. This chapter was closing, but consequences ripple outward, and Richard's removal was not the end, just the beginning. Suppliers reevaluated contracts, partners withdrew cautiously, investors demanded reforms. I was asked to stay on temporarily to help stabilize systems. I agreed under strict terms. Transparency, governance, respect for process. Things that had been optional before were now mandatory. Working inside that environment without Richard felt different. Quieter, slower, more thoughtful. Meetings included listening pauses where decisions were weighed. Instead of announced, people spoke more freely. Not because they trusted leadership yet, but because fear had loosened its grip. One afternoon, I walked through the same building where the insult had happened. Months earlier, it felt smaller, less imposing without his presence. Power changes the shape of spaces. I stood briefly in the lobby, remembering how I had felt walking in that first day. Composed, focused, unaware of how much would change. I realized something. Then I would not erase that moment, even if I could, because sometimes disrespect is information and information is power. As weeks passed, Richard faded from headlines, replaced by updates about restructuring and reform. His name became a cautionary reference rather than a symbol of success. I heard through quiet channels that he was angry, isolated, confused by how quickly loyalty disappeared. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt understanding. He had built relationships on fear, and fear does not stay when authority leaves. The final review report was released, detailed, thorough, and undeniable. It confirmed what had been documented long before: systemic failures, ignored warnings, leadership culture issues. With that release, my work there was finished. I closed files, returned access, and walked away. On my last day, I packed my things slowly. There was no celebration, no farewell speech, just quiet. Closure. As I stepped outside the building, the air felt lighter, the city louder, life continuing. I did not win something. I did not take anything from Richard. What happened was simpler and heavier. He met the consequences of the world he created. And I learned something too, that silence is not weakness, patience is not submission, and respect is not optional. It is structural. What comes next is not another battle, but reflection, and sometimes reflection is the hardest part. After I walked away from that building, I expected relief, maybe even a sense of victory. But what settled in instead was something quieter, a kind of emotional stillness. When a storm finally moves past and leaves everything exposed, the noise was gone, but the questions remained. People think revenge ends with applause or regret, but real consequences end with reflection. And reflection is uncomfortable because it turns inward. For the first time in months, I was no longer reacting to events. I was alone with my thoughts, and that was harder than any boardroom. I took time away from work, not a vacation exactly, just space, mornings without emails, evenings without strategy calls. I walked more, listened more, paid attention to the world outside power structures and corporate narratives. And slowly I began to notice how many people carry quiet stories like mine. Moments where they were dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, and how often those moments shape entire lives. Messages kept coming from strangers, women, especially sharing similar experiences, meetings where their ideas were ignored only to be repeated by someone else, promotions denied, credit stolen, respect withheld until it was too late. I realized my story was not rare, it was just visible. One message stayed with me. A young analyst wrote that she had watched the interview and decided not to quit her job that day. She said she realized the problem was not her silence, but the system around her. That message grounded me in a way nothing else had. But visibility has a cost, and soon invitations arrived, speaking requests, panels, articles. People wanted commentary on leadership, culture, power, accountability. I was careful with what I accepted because I did not want to become a symbol detached from substance. During one event, a moderator asked if I regretted not confronting Richard directly early on, if things could have ended differently. I paused because it was an honest question, and honesty deserves space. I said maybe, but confrontation only works when someone is capable of listening, and Richard never was. Not because he was evil, but because his success had trained him not to listen to voices that did not echo his own. That answer followed me home because it forced me to confront my own patterns. Where had I not listened? Where had I dismissed, quietly believing efficiency mattered more than empathy? Power blinds everyone eventually unless they fight it. I began reviewing my own leadership, the way I spoke in meetings, the way I made decisions, the way I reacted under pressure, because the difference between becoming what you oppose and becoming better than it is awareness. At the same time, Richard's story continued. Without me, lawsuits, negotiations, settlements. His name appeared less often, and when it did, it carried weight, not admiration. The machine moved on as it always does. And that was perhaps the sharpest lesson of all: power feels permanent until it is not. One evening, months later, I received a message from an unknown number. It was short, just a request to talk. I almost ignored it, but something told me not to. When I answered, I recognized his voice immediately. Richard sounded different. Not defeated, not angry, just uncertain. He said he wanted to understand what had happened, how things slipped so far so fast. I listened, and for the first time he listened too. Not interrupting, not deflecting. I told him the truth again, not softened, not sharpened, that the collapse did not begin with the review or the press or the board. It began years earlier, when he stopped seeing people as partners and started seeing them as tools. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I wish I had shaken your hand." That sentence held more weight than any apology because it acknowledged the moment without excuses. I told him it was never about the handshake. It was about what it represented. We ended the call without bitterness, without resolution, just honesty, and that felt like closure. After that, I focused on building differently, mentoring younger women, restructuring my own company culture to ensure respect was not performative, but practiced daily. I created systems where silence was questioned and dissent was protected. The irony was not lost on me, that the very systems I had built to protect others were now shaping something healthier. Sometimes I think back to that first day, the glass tower, the quiet insult, the decision I made not to react. but to observe if I had reacted emotionally. I would have lost credibility and opportunity. Patience gave me both. This story is not about revenge. It is about consequence, not about winning, but about revealing truth without anger, without fear, because truth does not need force. It only needs space. If there is a lesson here, it is this: the way you treat people when you believe you are untouchable will decide who stands with you when you are not, and respect given quietly is remembered longer than power taken loudly. After that last conversation with Richard, something finally settled inside me. Not forgiveness, not sympathy, just understanding, and understanding changes the weight of memories. I stopped replaying the insult, stopped imagining alternate endings because there was nothing left to prove. The story had already reached its truth. Life returned to a slower rhythm, my days filled with work that felt intentional, again not reactive. My company grew steadily, not louder but stronger. I chose projects carefully, turning down opportunities that felt impressive but hollow, because I had learned how dangerous hollow success can be. I spent more time mentoring young women, not in formal speeches but in quiet conversations, the kind that happen after meetings, when someone hesitates before leaving the room, asking questions they think might sound foolish. I answered them honestly because confidence grows best in safe spaces. One afternoon, a junior partner asked me how I stayed calm during everything, how I did not lash out when I was dismissed. I told her the truth. Calm was not natural, it was learned. Anger gives people an excuse to ignore you. Patience removes their defenses. That idea stayed with me because it explains so much about power dynamics. The loudest voice often hides the weakest position, while the quietest one is still gathering. Information. Months passed and Richard's company completed its restructuring, new leadership, new policies, public commitments to transparency. Some changes were real, others were symbolic, but even symbols matter when people are watching. I was invited to review their new governance framework. I declined politely. My role there was finished. Returning would have pulled me back into a story that no longer belonged to me. Instead, I focused on building something better, something that would not need a crisis to learn respect. Occasionally, I would catch a headline mentioning Richard briefly. No drama, no focus, just a name in context diminished by time, and I realized that legacy is not built by dominance, but by what remains after attention fades. I began speaking less publicly too, choosing depth over visibility because constant exposure can flatten meaning, and I wanted my work to speak louder than my story. One evening, while reviewing contracts, I paused, realizing how different my instincts had become. I now paid as much attention to how people spoke as to what they promised, because tone reveals truth faster than words. The insult that once felt personal now felt instructional. It taught me how quickly people reveal themselves when they think no one is watching, and how important it is to notice. There were moments when doubt surfaced, quiet questions about whether things could have ended more gently, whether less documentation or more confrontation would have changed anything. But those questions faded because reality answered them. People do not change until their patterns cost them something. I received an email from the analyst who had written months earlier. She had been promoted. She thanked me again, not for changing her company, but for changing how she saw herself. I closed my laptop and sat still, letting that moment land. It reminded me that impact is often indirect, unseen, measured not in headlines but in choices people make quietly. The world did not become fair overnight. Power imbalances did not disappear, but awareness spread, and awareness is the first crack in any rigid system. I learned to trust my instincts more fully, to honor discomfort as information, not weakness, and to never confuse politeness with respect. Sometimes I still think about that first meeting, the way my hand hung in the air for a second too long, the way silence filled the room, and how easy it would have been to shrink in that moment. But I did not shrink. I waited, and waiting changed everything. This story is not meant to inspire revenge. It is meant to remind that dignity is not given by others. It is maintained by how you respond when it is tested. People will always underestimate what they do not understand, especially quiet strength. But underestimation is an opportunity, not a sentence. If you are listening to this and you have ever been dismissed, overlooked, spoken over, remember, these moments of disrespect are not the end of your story. They are information, and information used wisely can change everything. Power fades, attention moves, but integrity compounds, and in the long run, that is what reshapes worlds. As time passed, I began to notice something unexpected. The story others told about what happened started to drift. It softened, sharpened, bent depending on who was speaking and why. Some framed it as a fall from grace, others as a warning about leadership culture. A few tried to turn it into a personal rivalry. I learned then that once a story leaves your hands, it becomes a mirror, reflecting the values of whoever holds it. At first, that bothered me. I wanted accuracy, clarity, truth, but I slowly understood that control over narrative is an illusion. The only thing you can control is your integrity and the consistency of your actions. Everything else will move on its own. My work shifted again, not because I chased change, but because change follows. Clarity companies reached out, not because of the headlines, but because they sensed caution in my approach. They wanted systems built to last, not shine, and I made my expectations clear from the start. Respect, transparency, accountability were not optional. Some potential clients walked away, and that was fine, because alignment matters more than revenue. I had learned that growth without values only delays collapse. One evening I attended a small private dinner. No press, no panels, just conversation among people who had lived through similar storms. A former executive spoke about how success had insulated him from feedback until everything unraveled. Another admitted she had ignored warnings to avoid conflict. Their honesty felt raw, unpolished, and valuable. Listening to them, I realized how rare it is for people to sit with failure without defensiveness, and how necessary it is for growth. Failure strips illusion faster than any critique. Later that night, someone asked me if I would ever write about my experience. I laughed quietly and said, maybe one day, but not yet. Stories need distance to become honest. Otherwise, they are still arguments inside myself. Another shift was happening. I was no longer defined by what I had endured, but by what I was choosing to build next, and that distinction mattered, because living in reaction keeps you tied to the past. I redesigned my company structure, flattening hierarchies, building clear paths for dissent, anonymous feedback channels, rotating leadership in meetings, simple practices that signaled listening was not symbolic, it was operational. At first, it slowed things down. Decisions took longer, debates lasted deeper, but the quality improved. Mistakes surfaced early. Trust grew, and with trust came resilience. There were days when pressure returned, deadlines, crises, unexpected losses, and I felt old instincts rise, the urge to push, dismiss, override. But awareness caught them, because awareness is the muscle patience builds. I thought about Richard then, not with judgment, but curiosity. I wondered if he would ever rebuild differently, if he would recognize the patterns that had led him there. Change requires humility, and humility rarely survives unchecked success. Sometimes former colleagues from his company reached out, sharing updates. Some reforms stuck, others faded. Habits return easily when attention moves on. That too was expected. Systems need constant reinforcement. Culture is not a policy, it is a practice. I stopped measuring success by size or visibility. Instead, I paid attention to sustainability, how decisions held up under stress, how people behaved when no one was watching. Those metrics told the real story. One afternoon, while mentoring a group of young professionals, a woman asked what she should do if her boss dismisses her publicly. The room went quiet. I recognized that silence immediately. I told her this: first, document everything. Second, build allies quietly. Third, do not internalize disrespect as truth. And finally, decide whether the environment is worth the cost. Sometimes the strongest move is leaving. Sometimes it is staying and changing things. But either way, the decision should be conscious, not reactive. After the session, she thanked me and said she felt seen. That word stayed with me, because being seen is the opposite of dismissal, and everyone needs it. Months later, I received an invitation to advise on a regulatory initiative focused on governance reform. It was serious work, slow, meticulous, not glamorous, but impactful. I accepted, because this was where systemic change happens, not in speeches but in frameworks. As I reviewed case studies, patterns emerged again and again. Charismatic leaders, insulated from challenge cultures built on speed over care, warning signs, ignored until consequences arrived. The story was familiar, but each time the human cost was different. It reinforced a belief that had been growing quietly. Power is neutral. It amplifies what is already there. If respect exists, power spreads it. If ego dominates, power magnifies damage. My own sense of identity continued to evolve. I was no longer the woman who had been dismissed, nor the one who had exposed anything. I was simply someone who paid attention and acted accordingly. Occasionally, doubt resurfaced late at night, the question of whether things could have unfolded without so much fallout. But doubt softened when I remembered how many warnings had been ignored before my involvement. Consequences do not appear without invitation. I learned to release responsibility for outcomes beyond my control. Clarity does not guarantee comfort, and truth does not guarantee gratitude, but they guarantee alignment. And alignment is peace. The world kept moving, markets shifted, new leaders rose, new scandals emerged, attention cycles turned, and my story became one among many. That was as it should be, because the true impact was not in headlines, it was in subtle changes, quieter meetings, better questions raised earlier, accountability embedded, not enforced. I realized then that the most powerful revenge is not destruction, it is transformation, especially when it happens without bitterness. If this chapter has taught me anything, it is that dignity maintained quietly can outlast dominance asserted loudly, and that waiting is not weakness when it is guided by purpose. Somewhere along the way, the insult lost its sting completely. It became just data, a moment that revealed a truth I needed to see. And when you finally see clearly, you no longer need closure. You simply move forward, carrying only what helps you build better. With distance came perspective, and perspective changed how I remembered everything. The meeting, the silence, the slow unraveling, it no longer felt like a sequence of dramatic moments, but like a long lesson unfolding one step at a time. Lessons rarely announce themselves, they repeat until you finally listen. I noticed how often people confuse intensity with importance. Richard had always been intense, loud schedules, urgent demands, constant motion, and that intensity created the illusion of strength. But real strength, I learned, moves differently. It pauses, it questions, it adapts. As my work expanded into advisory roles, I began seeing early versions of the same pattern. In other places, leaders praised for confidence, who never asked questions. Teams trained to execute, not to think. Warnings framed as negativity, dissent, labeled disloyalty. The language was different, but the structure was the same. When I pointed this out, some listened, others smiled politely and changed nothing. And I understood then that insight does not equal change, willingness does. I started choosing my battles carefully, because not every environment wants to be better. Some only want to look stable, and I had no interest in being decorative. There were moments when I wondered if my calm approach had cost me speed, if stronger confrontation earlier could have saved time. But then I remembered how resistance works. People defend what they feel accused of, and I had never wanted defense, I wanted clarity. Clarity works slowly, but it works deeply. One quiet morning, I revisited old notes from the early days of my company, handwritten ideas, reminders to myself about why I started, phrases like, build what you wish existed, listen when it is uncomfortable, do not trade, respect for access. Reading them felt like meeting an earlier version of myself, someone cautious but determined. I realized how close I had come to abandoning those values during the pressure months. How easy it would have been to compromise softened truths to stay welcomed. But compromise would have erased the very leverage that mattered. Leverage is not about force, it is about consistency. I thought about the people who had reached out to me during the collapse, not for revenge but for safety. and how many systems fail because people do not feel safe. Speaking truth, that realization reshaped my priorities. I began investing time into creating tools, not just advice frameworks, that made it easier for organizations to surface problems. Early anonymous reporting channels, independent audits, leadership training, focused on listening, not commanding. Some executives resisted these ideas, calling them inefficient. I smiled because inefficiency is often just the cost of prevention. There were days when exhaustion returned, when responsibility felt heavy, and I questioned whether staying in these spaces was worth the effort. Then I would receive a message from someone who said they felt empowered to speak up, or who avoided a crisis because a concern was addressed early. Those moments mattered more than recognition. I also learned to forgive myself for the parts I could not change. Forgiveness is not approval, it is release, and release creates room for better work. Occasionally I ran into people who still framed the story as a dramatic takedown. I let them because their interpretation said more about their values than mine. I no longer corrected every misunderstanding because peace is selective. As the years moved forward, Richard became a footnote, not in my life but in the broader story. His name surfaced occasionally attached to consulting roles or speaking engagements about lessons learned. I never attended them, but I hoped quietly that something had changed. One thing surprised me the most. I was no longer afraid of being underestimated the way I once was, because underestimation had proven to be a form of protection. It gave me space to observe and decide without pressure. Confidence no longer meant being seen, it meant being grounded. I noticed my voice changed in meetings. Slower, more deliberate. I asked better questions, listened longer. Silence stopped feeling awkward. It became useful. People often filled silence with truth. There was a moment during a late evening call with a new client when a senior executive interrupted a junior analyst, and I paused, then redirected the conversation back to her. She looked startled, then grateful. Later she emailed saying no one had ever done that before. Small acts reshape culture faster than policies. I began measuring success differently. Not by growth curves or public praise, but by moments like that. Moments when someone realized their voice mattered. This work was quieter than my earlier projects. Less dramatic, but more satisfying because it addressed root causes, not symptoms. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had responded to disrespect, and started seeing myself as someone who built environments where disrespect had less room to grow. The memory of that handshake refusal faded into something neutral, almost distant, and when I tried to recall the feeling attached to it, there was none, just awareness. I realized then that true resolution is emotional neutrality, not triumph, not bitterness, just clarity. If someone listening to this is waiting for a moment where everything feels justified or balanced, I want to be honest, that moment rarely comes. Instead, there is a gradual alignment where your actions match your values, and the noise fades. That alignment is quiet, but it is powerful. Looking back, I see that the insult was never the beginning. It was the signal, a signal to pay attention to patterns already present, a signal that something deeper needed to be addressed. And when you respond to signals instead of reacting to events, you stop being controlled by circumstance. This chapter of my life did not end with closure. It transformed into foundation. A foundation built on listening, documentation, patience, and respect. What comes next is not about standing against someone. It is about standing for something, and that shift changes everything. There was a moment sometime after everything settled when I realized I no longer introduced myself by what I did or what I had survived. I simply said my name and waited to see what followed. That small change felt important because it meant I was no longer carrying the story like armor. With that lightness came a different kind of responsibility. People listened more closely now, not because I demanded attention, but because consistency earns trust over time, and trust brings expectation. Others expected me to speak when things felt wrong, to notice what others missed. And that expectation required care. I began turning down more work than I accepted, not out of comfort, but out of clarity. I learned that saying no early is kinder than disengaging late, and that alignment saves everyone time, even if it costs opportunity. Some leaders wanted my involvement as insurance, a name to signal credibility without changing behavior. I recognized that pattern quickly and declined politely, because integrity does not work as decoration. Instead, I invested energy into long-term partnerships with people who asked uncomfortable questions, who welcomed critique, who understood that strength comes from exposure, not control. Those partnerships moved slower, but they endured. One of them involved a mid-sized company struggling quietly. Turnover was high, morale low, but profits steady. Leadership believed numbers meant health. I saw familiar signs: silence in meetings, ideas filtered upward. Only when safe, I suggested a listening audit, not a survey, not metrics, just facilitated conversations. Leadership hesitated, then agreed. What emerged was not rebellion, but exhaustion. People wanted clarity, boundaries, acknowledgement, and permission to speak without fear. The shift that followed was not dramatic, but measurable. Turnover slowed, engagement rose, mistakes surfaced earlier. Leadership learned to pause before reacting. Watching that change reminded me why patience mattered, why I had chosen not to explode months earlier. Patience builds room for learning. Explosions only create debris. I noticed my own reactions evolving too when faced with dismissal or interruption. I no longer internalized it. I redirected calmly, sometimes naming the behavior, sometimes adjusting the environment. The goal was not to win the moment, but to shape the system. There were days when I wondered if this quieter influence mattered, without headlines, without recognition. Then I remembered how many lives are shaped by invisible decisions. And I stayed the course. Occasionally, someone would bring up Richard indirectly, asking what I thought of his trajectory. I answered honestly that I hoped he had learned something, but learning cannot be verified from a distance. Only sustained behavior proves it. I did not track his story closely, not out of avoidance, but because fixation keeps old dynamics alive. I chose presence over hindsight. As years layered onto the experience, the emotional charge continued to fade. What remained was a framework, a way of seeing power dynamics. Earlier patterns, clearer consequences, inevitable. I began writing privately, notes, reflections, case observations, not to publish but to understand. Writing helped separate insight from memory, principle from personality. It allowed the story to become useful beyond its origin. One note stood out: power does not corrupt. It reveals. That line stayed with me because it explained so much of what I had witnessed. I shared that idea during a workshop and watched participants sit with it. Quietly, recognition passing across faces. Some nodded, others resisted, but seeds were planted. Resistance never bothered me anymore. Resistance means contact, and contact means potential. I also became more attentive to how I rested. Burnout hides behind purpose easily, and I learned to protect space for stillness, walks without podcasts, meals without screens, evenings where nothing was optimized, because sustainability applies to people too. During one of those evenings, I thought about the younger version of myself. Walking into that boardroom, composed, focused, unaware of the weight she was about to carry, I felt tenderness toward her. Not pride, not regret, just care. I wish she had known how strong she already was without needing proof. But strength often becomes visible only in hindsight. There was a quiet irony in how the insult that once felt diminishing had expanded my sense of self, not by hardening it, but by clarifying it. I stopped equating respect with approval, and that changed everything. Approval is fleeting, respect is structural. The more I built with that understanding, the less I needed validation, and the more effective my work became. I also noticed something else as I aged into this role. People interrupted me less, dismissed me less, not because culture had transformed overnight, but because boundaries radiate confidence when they are consistent. Confidence born from alignment does not need volume. When I speak now, I choose words carefully, not to soften truth, but to sharpen it. Precision matters when emotions run high. People often asked what I would do differently if given the chance, and the answer surprised them. Nothing significant, because reacting differently would have changed the outcome in ways that might have protected comfort instead of truth. Comfort delays learning, truth accelerates it. As this chapter settled fully into the past, I felt gratitude, not for the conflict, but for the clarity it forced. I would not seek it again, but I would not erase it either. If there is one thing I would want someone listening to take with them, it is this. When you are dismissed, you are being given information not about your worth, but about the environment you are in. And what you do with that information matters more than the dismissal itself. You can react and burn bridges, or you can observe and choose timing that protects your future. Both are human responses, only one builds leverage. Leverage is quiet, patient, ethical, and powerful. As I continue forward, my work remains grounded in that truth. Systems matter. Culture matters. Listening matters. And every small act of respect compounds into resilience. This story has traveled far from its origin, and that feels right because it was never meant to stay small. What remains is not anger, not triumph, but purpose refined, and that purpose guides what comes next. With time, the memory of conflict softened even more, not erased, just integrated like a scar that no longer aches, but still reminds you where you have been. I noticed how my reactions in everyday situations had changed. Interruptions no longer felt personal, dismissive tones no longer triggered urgency. I had learned to separate behavior from identity, and that separation gave me freedom. Freedom looks ordinary from the outside. It is saying no without guilt. It is leaving a room without replaying the conversation later. It is trusting that your value does not depend on being recognized in every moment. I began to see how many people live without that freedom. How often they second-guess themselves after meetings. How they rewrite emails to sound less firm, less present, less visible. And I understood why, because the cost of being fully yourself can feel high in systems that reward compliance. I made it a point to notice those moments and intervene when I could not dramatically. Just gently redirecting credit, asking someone to finish a thought, acknowledging effort out loud. These small actions shift gravity. In a room one afternoon during a strategy session, a junior employee challenged an assumption politely but firmly. The room tensed, waiting for a reaction. I watched the leader pause, then listen and adjust course. Afterward, the employee told me it was the first time she felt safe disagreeing. That moment mattered. Safety is invisible until it is missing, and powerful once it is built. I started to think less about leadership as direction, and more as containment, creating space where others can think clearly without fear, because fear narrows vision and clarity requires openness. That idea shaped how I mentored, how I structured teams, how I measured success. I stopped asking, "Are we winning?" and started asking, "Are we learning?" Because learning compounds while winning resets. There were still moments of challenge. Public scrutiny, difficult decisions, criticism that felt unfair, but I met them differently. Now, not with defense, but with inquiry. What information is here? What response aligns with my values? Alignment had become my compass. I also learned to let go of urgency. Urgency is often mistaken for importance, but it clouds judgment and creates false deadlines that benefit no one. Patience is not passive. It is deliberate restraint during a period of intense workload. I felt old patterns returning: tension, sleeplessness, over-preparation. I recognized the signs and stepped back, reprioritized, delegated, rested, because sustainable impact requires sustainable energy. I thought again about Richard, not as an individual but as a symbol of unchecked momentum. How quickly success can become insulation, and insulation becomes isolation. The lesson was not about him, it was about what happens when feedback disappears. Feedback is a form of care, ignoring it is neglect. I shared that idea during a workshop and watched as a room of executives went quiet. Silence can mean resistance or reflection. I waited and then questions came, thoughtful, honest, uncertain. That is where change begins. I noticed how differently people respond when they feel respected. Even criticism lands softer when it is delivered without condescension. Tone matters, context matters, intention matters. Those insights began influencing how I spoke publicly. Fewer declarations, more questions, fewer conclusions, more curiosity. Audiences leaned in, not because I had answers, but because I invited thinking. Thinking together builds trust faster than certainty. Sometimes people asked if I was afraid of being underestimated again. I smiled because underestimation no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a neutral condition, sometimes even an advantage. When expectations are low, you can exceed them quietly. When they are high, you are constantly defending perception. I learned to choose when to step forward and when to remain still. Movement for its own sake is noise. Purpose directs motion. My life outside work also shifted. Relationships deepened. I became more present, less distracted by proving something. Dinners lasted longer. Conversations wandered. Laughter returned because tension had loosened its grip. I realized how much of my earlier drive had been fueled by resistance, by pushing against systems rather than building within alignment. Releasing that resistance made space for joy. Joy does not mean ease, it means coherence. When what you do reflects who you are. There were moments of doubt, still moments when decisions felt heavy, but doubt no longer spiraled. It paused, asked questions, and then moved forward. I learned to trust that not every answer arrives immediately, and that waiting does not mean stagnation, it means readiness. This understanding extended to others too. I became more patient with growth, timelines, with mistakes, with learning curves, because pressure rarely accelerates wisdom. I thought about the younger professionals listening to this story, those still navigating dismissive environments. I wanted them to know that strength does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation. Sometimes it looks like documentation. Sometimes it looks like walking away. No response is neutral. Every choice carries consequence. Choosing intentionally is power. As this chapter deepened into perspective, I felt grounded, not triumphant, grounded in the knowledge that I could face complexity without losing myself. That grounding is rare and precious. This story no longer felt like something that happened to me. It felt like something that shaped me, and shaping is an active process. The insult was a spark, but the fire that followed was built from choices, patience, clarity, and restraint. And those are choices available to anyone willing to pause long enough to see them. By the time I reached this point in my life, I understood something that once felt abstract. Power does not announce itself. It reveals itself over time through patterns, repetition, and response. The real question is not who holds power, but how they use it when no one is watching. I noticed that my attention had shifted away from outcomes and toward processes. How decisions were made, who was included, who was protected, who was ignored. These details told the truth long before results appeared. This way of seeing changed everything for me. I could walk into a room and feel its culture before anyone spoke. The tension or openness, the hierarchy or collaboration. It was never about titles, it was about energy. When I met leaders, now I listen for curiosity more than confidence. Curiosity signals humility, confidence alone often signals defense. That distinction guided where I invested my time. There were moments when people tested boundaries, subtle dismissals, interruptions framed as efficiency. I responded calmly, naming the behavior without accusation. The effect was immediate, not because of authority, but because clarity disrupts unspoken norms. I learned that naming things gently, but directly, removes their power. Silence allows them to grow. This approach did not make everyone comfortable, but it made environments healthier, and over time people adapted because most want to work in places where they are respected, even if they are not used to it. I began receiving feedback that meetings felt different, slower but more thoughtful, quieter, but more honest. Those comments meant more to me than praise for results. There was a period when I revisited my earlier fear of being invisible and realized it had transformed into something else. Invisibility no longer scared me. What scared me was becoming disconnected from my values. Visibility without alignment felt hollow. That realization simplified decisions. When an opportunity conflicted with my principles, I declined without regret. When it aligned, I committed fully. I watched younger colleagues navigate similar crossroads. Some chose speed, others chose substance. Neither path was wrong, but awareness mattered. One afternoon, during a mentoring session, someone asked how to tell when patience becomes avoidance. It was a thoughtful question. I paused, then said, "Patience still moves forward, avoidance stays stuck. Patience gathers information, builds capacity, and acts when timing is right. Avoidance delays because of fear." The distinction resonated because many confuse calm with passivity and action with courage. But courage often looks like restraint. I reflected on how often women are expected to absorb disrespect gracefully and how that expectation trains silence rather than strength. I made it a point to challenge that narrative. Patience is not endurance, it is strategy. Strategy has direction. Endurance just survives. As my work matured, I noticed fewer reactive crises, not because risk disappeared, but because systems caught issues earlier. Prevention does not make headlines, but it saves people. I thought again about Richard, not with resentment, but as a case study of what happens when leadership outpaces reflection. His story was no longer personal, it was instructional. Instruction requires distance, and distance brings compassion. Not the kind that excuses harm, but the kind that understands cause and effect. That compassion extended to myself too. I stopped judging past choices through present awareness. Growth makes earlier decisions look naive, but they were made with the information available, then honoring that matters. I became more forgiving of learning curves, including my own. There were still moments when I felt the weight of responsibility, advising on decisions that affected livelihoods, careers, futures. I did not take that lightly. I slowed down, consulted widely, documented thoroughly because speed feels impressive, but care creates durability. Durability became my metric. I noticed how language shapes culture, small shifts, like replacing blame with inquiry, assuming good intent until proven, otherwise celebrating learning, instead of punishing mistakes. Those changes accumulated over time. I saw teams transform, not dramatically, but steadily. Trust deepened, communication improved, and resilience increased. Those moments reaffirmed why I stayed in this work, despite its challenges, because systems shape lives, and changing systems changes lives quietly, but profoundly. I began to feel a sense of stewardship, not ownership over outcomes, but responsibility for process, ensuring fairness, transparency, respect. Stewardship demands humility. It recognizes that leadership is temporary influence borrowed from trust, and that trust must be renewed daily. I thought about the younger version of myself again, walking into that boardroom unaware of how much she would learn. I wished I could tell her that one day she would not need to be seen to feel secure. Security would come from self-knowledge, not external validation. This chapter of the story no longer felt heavy. It felt instructive, like a long apprenticeship in power dynamics and self-trust. If someone listening feels tired from navigating dismissive environments, I want them to know, exhaustion does not mean failure. It means you are carrying weight that should not be yours alone. Choose where to invest your energy, because not every system deserves your patience. Sometimes the bravest decision is not to fix what is broken, but to build something new. That understanding changed how I measured impact. Not by how much I endured, but by how wisely I chose, and wisdom always begins with seeing clearly. As I moved deeper into this phase of my life, I noticed something subtle but important. I was no longer driven by proving anything. Not my competence, not my resilience, not my worth. That hunger had faded, and in its place was a steadier rhythm, a kind of inner agreement that I did not need permission to take up space. That shift changed how I entered rooms. I no longer scanned faces for approval or resistance. I focused instead on listening, on sensing where clarity was missing, where questions were being avoided. This made my presence quieter but more precise. I realized that earlier in my career, I had mistaken endurance for strength. I believed that if I could withstand dismissal, interruption, or disrespect long enough, I would eventually earn recognition. But endurance alone does not create change. It only delays decision. Decision is where power actually lives. Learning. This did not make me harder, it made me clearer. When boundaries were crossed, I named it without drama. When values were misaligned, I disengaged without explanation, not out of arrogance but out of respect for my own limits. People reacted differently to this. Some adjusted, some resisted, some disappeared. And all of those outcomes were acceptable because clarity always reorganizes relationships. I began noticing how often people stay in environments that slowly drain them because leaving feels like failure. I wanted to rewrite that story. Leaving can be an act of wisdom. Staying can be an act of courage, and neither choice defines your value. What defines you is whether the choice is conscious. I carried that belief into my mentoring work, encouraging others to pause before reacting, to ask what they actually wanted, rather than what they felt pressured to pursue. The relief on their faces told me how rarely they had been given that permission. There were moments when I felt sadness, true sadness for the years I spent normalizing discomfort. Sadness for the times I had minimized myself to fit into systems that did not deserve that. Sacrifice. But sadness passed because regret only matters if it leads to insight, and insight had already done its work. I stopped replaying conversations from the past, not because they were unimportant, but because they no longer needed revision. The meaning had been extracted in their place. I began imagining futures, not fantasies, but structures, teams built on trust, organizations where feedback was not a threat, where silence was not mistaken for agreement. These visions grounded my work. I learned to measure impact in time horizons, not quarters or years, but decades. Would this decision still make sense when pressure fades? Would it protect people I might never meet? Those questions slowed me down, but they also kept me aligned. There was a particular moment during a difficult advisory engagement when a senior leader dismissed a concern raised by a junior colleague. The room froze and all eyes shifted, waiting for the familiar pattern. I felt the old tension rise, then settle. I spoke calmly, redirecting attention back to the concern, asking for it to be fully explored. The leader hesitated, then agreed. Afterward, the junior colleague thanked me quietly, and I realized again how fragile moments of courage are, how easily they can be crushed or nurtured by the people in the room. That awareness made me more intentional about my presence. Even silence carries weight, and choosing when to speak is a form of leadership. I also noticed that as I grew more comfortable with uncertainty, I became less attached to outcomes. I focused on process, knowing that good process increases the chance of good outcomes without guaranteeing them. Letting go of guarantees was freeing because it allowed me to act ethically without needing control. Control had once felt like safety, now it felt like illusion. As the story of my earlier conflict receded further into the background, I felt gratitude for the space it created, not because of the pain, but because of the clarity that followed. Clarity has a way of simplifying life. Without making it small, I found joy again in learning, in curiosity, in asking questions without immediately seeking answers. Curiosity is lighter than certainty and more generative. I began reading differently, listening differently, even disagreeing differently, no longer trying to win, but to understand. That shift softened many interactions and sharpened the important ones. People sometimes mistook this calm for detachment, but it was the opposite. It was engagement without entanglement, care without control. I thought often about how easily power can distort self-perception, and how constant reflection is required to counter that distortion. Reflection is not self-criticism, it is self-maintenance. Without it, even the most well-intentioned leaders drift. I built reflection into my routines, journaling after difficult conversations, seeking feedback from people with less power than me, creating structures that allowed truth to reach me without punishment. These practices were not dramatic, but they were protective. They guarded against the very patterns I had once confronted. I also became more selective about whose opinions I carried. Opinions are heavy, and not all of them deserve space. Discernment is not dismissal, it is curation. There were still challenges, moments when values clashed or progress stalled, but I met them with steadiness instead of urgency. Knowing that urgency often serves fear, not truth. This steadiness changed my relationships too. Conversations deepened, conflicts resolved faster because I no longer avoided discomfort or escalated it. Discomfort became a signal, not a threat. I noticed how much energy that saved, how much clarity it created, and how sustainable it felt. Compared to earlier years of constant vigilance, I had stopped bracing for impact because I trusted my ability to respond. That trust was earned slowly through experience, reflection, and restraint. If there is one thing this phase of my life taught me, it is that growth often looks like subtraction, letting go of narratives, roles, expectations that no longer serve. What remains after subtraction is not emptiness, but essence. And essence is powerful because it is simple. As I continued forward, I felt ready for whatever came next, not because I knew what it would be, but because I knew who I was without needing a crisis to remind me. As I reached the end of this long chapter, I realized something important. Endings are quieter than beginnings. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic moment where everything clicked into place. Instead, there was a gradual settling like dust after a storm. The world kept moving, and so did I. I used to think resolution meant closure, a clear emotional finish, a sense that everything had balanced out. But real resolution is simpler. It is the absence of tension where tension used to live. It is waking up without replaying old moments. It is entering rooms without bracing yourself. I noticed that the story no longer followed me into new spaces. People who met me later knew nothing about what had happened, and that felt freeing. I was not a lesson or a symbol to them. I was just a person, and being just a person again mattered more than I expected. With that freedom came responsibility, not to the past, but to the future. I paid closer attention to how my choices shaped environments, how small decisions created ripple effects. I understood that leadership is not about moments, it is about patterns. Patterns of listening, patterns of response, patterns of respect. I also understood that power never disappears. It only changes hands, and if you are not intentional about how you hold it, you will repeat the same harm, even with better intentions. That awareness kept me humble. I built reflection into everything, not as punishment but as maintenance, asking regularly, who am I protecting with this decision? Who am I excluding? What am I afraid to name? These questions became anchors. There were times when the old instinct returned, the urge to stay silent, to keep things smooth. But now I recognized it for what it was, a learned response, not a truth. I gave myself permission to speak when it mattered, and to stay quiet, when silence was strategic, not when it was imposed. That distinction changed my life. I also learned to forgive others more easily, not because they deserved it, but because carrying resentment keeps you tied to the very dynamics you want to leave. Forgiveness does not erase accountability, it just releases you from replaying the same scene. Richard eventually faded fully from my thoughts, not because he was insignificant, but because he no longer held, meaning my story had grown beyond him, and that was the final shift. What stayed was the lesson that dismissal is information, that silence can be strategy, that patience without purpose is endurance, but patience with clarity is power, that respect is not a reward, it is a requirement. I began sharing that lesson quietly with those who asked, never preaching, never dramatizing, just offering it as an option. Not everyone is ready to hear it, and that is fine. Timing matters. I also learned that not every injustice needs to be corrected by you. Sometimes the most powerful response is choosing a different environment, one where your energy builds instead of repairs. Repair work is noble, but it should not be your only option. Looking back, I no longer see the insult as a wound. I see it as a signal flare. It showed me where I was, and more importantly, where I did not belong. That clarity saved me years. If you are listening to this and you are in a place where your voice is dismissed, your presence minimized, your work taken without acknowledgement, I want you to hear this clearly. Your worth is not determined by how others treat you. It is revealed by how you choose to respond. You do not have to explode to be powerful. You do not have to endure to be strong. You do not have to prove yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes the strongest move is to observe, document, prepare, and choose your moment. Sometimes it is to walk away. Sometimes it is to stay and build slowly. There is no single right answer, only the one that aligns with who you want to become. Revenge is loud and brief, consequences quiet and lasting. What changed everything for me was not anger but clarity, not reaction but restraint, not dominance but alignment, and alignment does something remarkable. It frees you. It frees you from needing approval, from chasing validation, from shrinking or hardening yourself to fit broken systems. When you are aligned, you can move through disrespect without absorbing it, through conflict without losing yourself, through power without becoming distorted. That is the real victory. So if there is one moral I would leave you with, it is this: pay attention to how people treat you when they believe they are untouchable. Do not rush to react. Let their behavior give you information, and then choose your response in a way that protects your future, not just your pride. Because in the end, the most powerful revenge is not destruction. It is becoming so grounded, so clear, so intentional, that what once tried to diminish you no longer has any place in your life. And when that happens, everything truly changes.